In a room kept warm by stoves and headquarters routine, Eisenhower reads a press briefing transcript more slowly than he reads maps. The paper is thin, the type uneven, the words ordinary at first glance. Yet he lingers on them, as if each sentence must be weighed like an order, because words, once released, cannot be recalled. Outside, the Ardennes still smolders. The battle is not yet a memory. It is ash on uniforms and frozen mud in boot seams. Staff cars come and go through grey light. Men speak in lowered voices. The enemy is being pushed back, but the deeper danger has moved indoors, the unity that made victory possible. A young staff officer watches Eisenhower's face from the edge of the room. Ike is not a man who performs anger. He is practiced at absorbing it, redirecting it, turning emotion into process. That is why the officer notices the smallest change, an extra pause, a tightening at the jaw like a crack forming in ice that everyone assumes is solid. Then the name appears, Montgomery. It lands without sound, but the room seems to feel it. British pride, American losses, the bruised psychology of command, everything that had been held together by necessity now shifts, as if a match has been struck near gasoline. The war is still unfinished, and yet the argument over who saved whom has already begun. This is the problem Eisenhower was built to solve, and the one no map can clarify. How do you discipline a hero without breaking the coalition that needs him? How do you defend men who bled in the snow without humiliating an ally whose government and public demand dignity? The line between correction and collapse is thin, and it runs straight through his desk. He reaches the end of the transcript and closes the folder not gently. The sound is small, but final. No one speaks. In headquarters, silence. Even furniture seems to understand what is at stake. Reputations, trust, and the authority of the supreme commander over men who do not belong to one nation. This is where the story begins at the end of a rivalry that has been burning for months, just before a boundary is drawn in plain language. And somewhere in that coming exchange, a sentence will form that people will remember as legend, because it is the sentence everyone has been waiting for. Ardennes Offensive, January 1945 K. Akhri Haftan mein deredere apni takat ko raha, the magar shah sati aftershocks golian ke chamosh hon se pele hi shuru hochuke the. While artillery still answers across frozen ridgelines, another front opens in staff rooms and messes one made of phrases, headlines, and the slow corrosion of trust. To American commanders, Montgomery's public tone does not sound like analysis. It sounds like ownership. They hear, behind the careful words, a claim that the crisis was mastered because he arrived an implication that American blood became effective only when filtered through British order. In a war built on combined effort, that kind of suggestion lands like an accusation. Across the Channel and inside British headquarters, the reaction is read differently. American outrage is heard as volatility, as ingratitude, as a dangerous inability to accept that coalition command sometimes demands humiliation for the sake of survival. The British have their own pressures, public morale, national pride, and the need to believe their most famous general still matters in the final act. Eisenhower stands between these interpretations like a man between two weather fronts. Strategy can move divisions. It cannot heal wounded prestige. Maps cannot show what it costs when senior men begin to believe the alliance is unfair, or worse, dishonest. And a supreme commander who loses the confidence of either side becomes a coordinator in name only. In one hallway, far from microphones and communiques, an exhausted American officer folds a newspaper with stiff hands. The ink smears slightly against his glove. He mutters, almost to himself, "We didn't freeze for someone else's speech. It is not eloquent. It is not meant to be. It is the sound of a private debt being publicly reassigned." And all the while, Germany remains capable of killing thousands. The Reich is wounded, not harmless. The enemy still has artillery, still has armor, still has the ability to exploit any hesitation that spreads through Allied command. Discipline is not a virtue here, it is a requirement for staying alive. That is the irony that hangs over January 1945. Victory can be delayed by ego faster than by enemy armor. And as the arguments harden into resentment, a rumor begins to form at Schaeff of a sentence, blunt enough to stop the bleeding, and risky enough to shake the entire coalition. Somewhere in the corridors of Schaeff, the story condenses into a phrase, "You're done." It travels the way wartime rumors always travel, carried not by official papers, but by the appetite for clarity. Men who have spent months speaking in careful phrases suddenly imagine a sentence sharp enough to cut through everything: pride, protocol, and the slow poison of public insinuation. But what the phrase ended is often misunderstood. Eisenhower did not remove Montgomery from command in a dramatic gesture, and he could not have done so without detonating the politics of the alliance. What was ended was something quieter, and therefore more decisive: Montgomery's freedom to shape the narrative of the war as if it belonged to him. In coalition warfare, stories are weapons. Whoever owns the story can wound a partner without firing a shot. Eisenhower's authority was real, but it was also bounded. Coalition command is power surrounded by politics, and politics does not salute. Every directive had an echo in London. Every American reaction had weight in Washington. Two governments, two publics, and two armies worth of reputation pressed inward on every choice, narrowing the space in which a supreme commander could act. That pressure explains why the rumor mattered. The fantasy of bluntness spreads because bluntness is what everyone secretly wanted. Americans who felt robbed of credit, British officers who feared their icon was being cornered, and staff men who knew that indecision could be as lethal as any German counterattack. A clean sentence promised a clean world. The reality, however, was never going to be clean. Eisenhower's solution was surgical, not theatrical: demand an apology, contain the damage, and quietly rebalance influence so that one man could no longer speak as if he represented the whole front. It was not punishment for a mistake in tactics. It was a boundary drawn around ego, because ego had begun to threaten the machinery of victory. And yet, a single sentence still persists in memory. Not because it was spoken exactly as legend claims, but because it expresses what happened in essence. A limit was finally enforced. To understand why that limit took so long, and why it mattered so much, we have to turn the film backward, to the long fuse that had been burning for years, waiting for one spark. Bernard Montgomery built a wartime identity, the way an engineer builds a bridge: measured, deliberate, intolerant of improvisation. He believed morale could be manufactured if the plan was clear enough and the commander's certainty was visible enough. The beret, the caravans, the set-piece briefings, these were not vanity in his mind, but tools. If men saw assurance, they would act with it. In war, he treated confidence like artillery, something you could lay down in advance. El Alamein became his credential, and he carried it like a passport through every later argument. In October and November 1942, the British Eighth Army broke Rommel's line in the desert, and Montgomery emerged as the face of a victory Britain urgently needed. That success did not just defeat an enemy position, it established a personal claim proof, in his own telling, that method and will could bend a war back into shape. After that, he did not merely propose, he testified. Inside his headquarters, that testimony hardened into culture. Staff work under Montgomery was famous for its clarity and infamous for its certainty. Orders were simplified until they felt inevitable. Doubt was treated not as a useful warning, but as disloyalty to the plan. There was a moral code in it: discipline, preparation, restraint, but also a quiet intimidation. If the commander's confidence was the system's fuel, questioning it threatened to stall the engine. From that culture grew a conviction that wars are won by one decisive thrust, not by sprawling compromise. Montgomery preferred concentration, massed strength directed at a chosen point, a single narrative line that could be explained to armies and publics alike. He distrusted dispersed effort because dispersed effort diluted meaning. To him, broad strategies produced broad explanations, and broad explanations produced doubt. He wanted a war that looked, from above, like a straight road to Berlin. To the British public, this made him reassuring. Britain had endured early disasters and long years of attrition. Montgomery offered the image of competence without panic, of control without hysteria. He became, for many, the reliable face of a hard war, an officer who seemed to promise that sacrifice would not be wasted. His fame was not simply celebrity, it was national comfort in uniform. But to many Americans arriving in force in 1943 and 1944, that same certainty read differently. They heard condescension where the British heard steadiness, and they saw a man who spoke as if Allied effort existed to validate his theory. Their commanders, accustomed to bluntness and speed, bristled at the sense that one British general expected credit as a matter of rank, not contribution. In a coalition, tone is never neutral. It is a claim. Here, the moral seed takes root. When a commander needs the story to be about him, the mission becomes a stage, and stages demand outcomes that prove the actor right. Success becomes not only victory, but vindication. And once vindication is required, risk is no longer weighed only against enemy strength. It is weighed against reputation. That is how competence can drift toward recklessness without changing its vocabulary. Because now, the war is moving into Western Europe, and the decisive fights are no longer fought by one nation alone. The next man we follow will not be judged by how brightly he shines, but by whether the whole machine keeps turning because his battlefield is not a desert front, but an alliance. Dwight Eisenhower entered the war as a different kind of power. He was not the battlefield virtuoso who could smell a weak flank from a ridgeline, nor the commander who dazzled subordinates with sudden tactical brilliance. His strength was steadier, less visible, and in coalition war far more rare, the ability to remain calm while incompatible men collided around him. In a conflict defined by scale, he understood that the loudest egos were not merely personalities, they were forces that could bend strategy. His creed, when reduced to its simplest form, was almost mechanical. Coalition warfare was a machine. It could crush an enemy only if all its major parts turned together, in rhythm, under strain. If one part seized, if a national pride or a famous commander refused to turn, then the whole machine would shudder. The Germans could be beaten by superior numbers and industry. An alliance could be beaten by something quieter, resentment. In rooms where dominance was expected, Eisenhower often did something that looked like weakness to the untrained eye. He listened. He allowed another man to spend his certainty. He let arguments run until their true motive revealed itself: strategy, ambition, fear, or the need to be seen as essential. A staff officer might watch him, hands folded, expression neutral, taking in the temperature of the room the way another commander might read the wind. His authority was not in interruption. It was in the patience that made interruption unnecessary. And patience, at SHAEF, was not a virtue, it was a workload. The Supreme Commander's burden was not only the German army, it was the management of Patton's speed and ego, Bradley's loyalty and pride, Montgomery's certainty and public standing, and Churchill's political gravity. While Washington watched British influence, London watched American dominance, and Germany watched for cracks like a prisoner watching a lock. Every disagreement carried the weight of two nations' memories, and every compromise risked being interpreted as surrender. This is where the fundamental conflict begins to harden into shape. Montgomery seeks primacy, the right to concentrate resources, to define the decisive blow, and to own the narrative that follows. Eisenhower seeks equilibrium, a front that advances as a system, an alliance that feels respected, and a victory that does not require one man to be crowned to be accepted. One aims for a single spotlight, the other tries to keep the lights on in every room. The irony, even in 1944, is already present. The man most capable of compromise will eventually be forced to deliver the harshest boundary, because compromise cannot survive when it becomes permission for one personality to dominate the entire war. Eisenhower's restraint is not softness, it is an attempt to delay the moment when authority must become visible, and therefore painful. That moment approaches as victory in France creates a new problem: speed without supplies. Armies surge forward faster than fuel can follow, and in the gap between ambition and capacity, old arguments return with sharper edges, because when resources are finite, strategy becomes personal, and the next collision will not be about maps alone. In September 1944, the war in the West feels suddenly elastic, stretching forward faster than anyone predicted, then snapping back wherever fuel and bridges cannot follow. Eisenhower, worn down by months of command, and slowed by a nagging injury that keeps him from moving with ease, is forced to conduct power not from a tank turret or a map table on the line, but from rooms where pressure arrives in polished sentences. Montgomery arrives with those sentences prepared. He has a theory, and he has a reputation built to protect it. The Germans, he argues, are reeling. The time for tidiness is over. What is needed is one overwhelming thrust concentration, priority, and speed driving straight through the northern corridor and into the heart of Germany before the enemy can reset. But for that thrust to be his, the supplies must be his too. It is an argument made in the language of inevitability. Trucks, fuel, ammunition, bridging units, everything that keeps armies alive are finite, and Montgomery wants the war's oxygen routed through his campaign. To many Americans in the room, the demand sounds less like strategy than ownership, not only of resources, but of the ending. In coalition war, the line between best plan and my plan is thin, and Montgomery walks it with confidence. Eisenhower has spent the war absorbing other men's urgency, translating it into a structure all can accept. But here, his patience tightens into something rarer. Public edge, he interrupts. The words are simple, almost domestic in their bluntness. Steady, I'm your boss. Not shouted, not theatrical. Precisely because it is controlled, it lands. It is the sound of authority reminding a famous subordinate that fame is not rank. For a fraction of a moment, Montgomery's mask slips. He offers a quick apology fast enough to be calculated, but revealing in the very speed of it, he knows the line exists. He knows he has stepped close to it before. In his world, an apology is not surrender. It is a tool to keep the larger demand alive. He retreats half a pace, not out of humility, but out of instinct for how much resistance the alliance can tolerate in one sitting. And Eisenhower, even after drawing the boundary, still grants him a gamble. This is the quiet tragedy of coalition command. Harmony is often purchased with risk. Eisenhower cannot afford to humiliate Britain's most famous field commander, and he cannot afford an open fracture when Germany is still armed. So he gives Montgomery enough to try to test the theory, to chase the decisive stroke, while keeping the broader front from becoming hostage to one man's ambition. The irony is already forming, even before the operation has a name in public memory. The very gamble meant to validate Montgomery's decisive thrust doctrine will sharpen every criticism of it. That speed on paper is not speed on roads. That certainty does not create bridges. That a plan can be brilliant and still be brittle. War is about to become logistics, weather, and the price of wanting history to end on your signature, and the first invoice will come sooner than anyone expects. The breakout from Normandy did not simply open France, it opened distance. In August 1944, American and British columns surged through gaps that the German army could no longer seal, and the map began to move faster than the supply system that fed it. The battlefield changed shape, not hedgerows and strongpoints, but miles. Every day of rapid advance stretched the Allied rear like a rubber band, pulled tight depots left behind, beaches now far away, pipelines not yet built, rail lines shattered by bombing and retreat. For a moment it felt like liberation had its own momentum. Then the armies discovered the oldest law of modern war. You can move only as fast as you can eat, fuel, and fire. Ports, roads, and rail lines became more decisive than slogans. Cherbourg had been taken, but it was damaged and slow to restore. The great prize, Antwerp, was captured intact in early September, yet could not be used until the Scheldt estuary was cleared, a geographic fact that turned triumph into delay. Roads choked with traffic. Bridges that existed on paper lay in rivers. Railway maps lied because they did not show craters, missing locomotives, and the silent sabotage of wrecked marshalling yards. Staff officers pinned colored arrows across France, but the arrows assumed a world where capacity was infinite. Capacity was never infinite. It was the invisible wall the war kept colliding with. Eisenhower's broad front approach, so often described as philosophy, was in practice logistics first and ideology second. He did not fear decisive battle, he feared decisive starvation. If one spearhead received everything, then every other army would stall, and a stalled front gave Germany time to rebuild coherence, time to move reserves, time to fortify rivers and cities. A broad front-spread pressure kept multiple routes open and reduced the chance that a single shortage could halt the entire campaign. The method looked slow to men who dreamed of a dramatic finish, but it was designed for a war whose true terrain was tonnage. Eisenhower was trying to keep the machine turning, even if it turned without glamour. On the roads, the doctrine was measured by men who had never attended a strategy conference. A truck driver on the Red Ball Express did not speak in thrusts or axes of advance. He spoke in gallons, tire treads, and hours without sleep. He drove through the night with blackout lights like small dying stars, following a route marked by signs and military police, passing wrecks in ditches and convoys stalled behind breakdowns. When he stopped, it was not for rest but for refueling, loading, unloading, and starting again. He knew the front was hungry because the crates vanished the moment he arrived. If the war was moving forward, it was moving forward one load at a time. In that environment, Montgomery's demand for concentrated supply became, in American eyes, a demand for concentrated credit. He argued that priority would produce decision that one properly fed thrust could end the campaign before winter. But Americans heard something else beneath it, the desire to be the man who finished Germany, the man whose campaign history would remember. The disagreement was not merely arithmetic, it was psychological. To distribute supplies was to distribute importance. In a coalition where both nations needed to feel indispensable, supply tables became moral documents. When Montgomery pressed for priority, he pressed on the raw nerve of authorship, who would be seen as the war's main character when the final pages were written. As September turned to October, the front widened and the enemy stiffened. The German army, battered but not dead, began to rebuild lines behind rivers and forests, using the time that Allied shortages granted them. Fuel constraints forced pauses that looked, from the German perspective, like mercy. Weather began to erode air support. Mud returned, then rain, then the first hints of ice. Every major decision became a wager against winter. Push now and risk outrunning the supplies completely, or slow down and risk facing a rearmed enemy behind prepared defenses. The Allied advance had been a sprint. Now it threatened to become a march, and marches have a way of grinding down certainty. By late autumn, the tyranny of logistics had reshaped everything, including personalities. When resources are finite, arguments stop being abstract. Every request feels like theft, every denial like insult, every compromise like surrender. Men who might have tolerated each other in abundance became sharp in scarcity, because scarcity makes pride loud. And in that loudness, the coalition discovered a new danger, not German armor, but the weapon of reputation used to seize supplies, claim victories, and force choices that could not be justified by numbers alone. What they were building now was not just an operation, but a proving ground, one narrow, elegant plan that promised to outrun the problem itself and to settle the argument in a single leap. In September 1944, impatience becomes a kind of optimism. The Allied armies have broken out of Normandy, raced across France, and begun to feel the possibility of ending the war before the year turns. Germany looks unsteady, its retreats rapid, its formations frayed. In that moment, a plan takes shape that promises what logistics has been denying. A shortcut. Airborne drops seize bridges in the Netherlands. A ground column follows a narrow road like a needle threading cloth. The Rhine is crossed, the Ruhr is threatened. The war, it seems, can be made to conclude in a single brilliant motion. The idea has a clean, almost architectural beauty. Speed replaces accumulation. Surprise replaces siege. One highway, elevated in places, bordered by canals, ditches, and low fields, becomes the spine of the operation. If the bridges stand, the column moves. If the column moves, Germany cannot reorganize. It is a plan that turns geography into a promise, and in staff rooms it feels like relief, an answer to scarcity, a way to outrun the tyranny of fuel and tonnage by winning before tonnage matters. For Montgomery, it is also something else. It is the chance to validate the theory that has followed him since North Africa. Concentrate, strike, and let decision do what grinding cannot. The operation's name Market Garden splits the idea into two parts, but the ambition is singular. Market will be the airborne seizure of bridges. Garden will be the armored thrust to exploit them. If it works, the war's ending will wear a simple narrative, one decisive push, one commander's clarity made real on the map. On the morning of the drops, the sky offers calm. Paratroopers fall through open air into a landscape that looks, from above, almost peaceful patches of green, thin roads, the glint of water. Men land hard, gather their equipment, and move with the practiced urgency of those trained to treat minutes as ammunition. For a moment, the enemy seems absent. That absence is deceptive. The real enemy is time, the fact that every delay, Every wrong turn, every bridge not taken on schedule becomes a tax that compounds. The plan depends on a single road, and single roads do not forgive. The highway becomes a choke point almost immediately. One disabled vehicle can halt miles of traffic behind it. A blown bridge forces detours through narrow villages. German artillery, even when limited, does not need to destroy the whole column, only to interrupt it. The operation's elegance collides with geography, and geography does not negotiate. Canals and ditches channel movement into predictable lanes. Fields that look passable become traps for heavy armor. The ground war is forced to move like water through a narrow pipe, and any obstruction raises pressure everywhere. Meanwhile, Germany recovers faster than Allied optimism expected. Units thought shattered reveal teeth. Ad hoc battle groups form around whatever is available: armored remnants, infantry, training units, police formations stitched together by the simple fact that defending a bridge requires only enough men to delay. In the Arnhem area, the presence of German armored forces, including elements of 2 SS Panzer Corps, complicates what was supposed to be a rapid seizure. Intelligence, never perfect, becomes painfully expensive when a timetable is unforgiving. Arnhem becomes the symbol because it concentrates the moral drama of the operation into one word. A bridge stands there, and men reach for it with everything they have. Paratroopers and glider infantry fight with the urgency of those who understand they are holding a door open for an army that must arrive on schedule. Street by street, house by house, the battle narrows. Radios fail. Ammunition runs low. Reinforcement is delayed not by cowardice, but by physics. The clogged road, the contested bridges behind them, the weight of vehicles that cannot simply fly forward. Courage is abundant. Reinforcement is not. The phrase that survives in memory, "a bridge too far," has endured because it describes more than distance. It describes an assumption that the Allies could still treat the war as a matter of will and speed alone. At Arnhem, Will meets a schedule and loses. The men who hold positions near the bridge are not defeated by lack of bravery. They are defeated by the gap between plan and capacity, between what looks possible on a map and what remains possible after the first delay. When the operation fails, it does not erase Allied strength. The Western Allies remain overwhelmingly powerful. But it damages something subtler, the aura of inevitability around the single thrust. Market Garden was meant to demonstrate that concentrated priority would produce decisive victory. Instead, it demonstrates how brittle a decisive plan becomes when it requires perfection from weather, traffic, intelligence, and enemy weakness all at once. The coalition does not simply lose ground, it loses a clean story. The moral lesson lands quietly, because the dead do not need lectures. Boldness is not the same as feasibility, and proof by gamble rarely persuades the critics it was designed to silence. For Montgomery, the operation becomes both defense and vulnerability, something he can frame as near success, and something others can cite as evidence that the war cannot be rushed into a single signature. And as autumn deepens and the front stiffens, the argument does not end with Arnhem. It hardens into memos, meetings, and a rivalry sharpened by the knowledge that winter is coming, and Germany will soon choose its own moment to strike. By autumn 1944, the front has slowed enough for another kind of battle to become audible. The guns still fire, but between offensives the war moves into folders and conference rooms. It becomes a staff war memos typed in careful language, maps covered in colored grease pencil, briefings that begin with logistics and end with tone. The question beneath the paper is simple and dangerous. How does Germany collapse? And more precisely, whose method will be remembered as the method that did it? Eisenhower's approach is systemic. He wants power built along the entire line, because he does not trust single points of failure. A broad front keeps pressure everywhere, keeps German reserves uncertain, and allows each army group to advance as supply and terrain permit. It is not romantic, but it is resilient. He is building a hydraulic system. Push across the whole barrier until it breaks, then flood through with mass. If the enemy reinforces one sector, another sector gains. If weather stalls one army, another keeps moving. For Eisenhower, the coalition is a machine designed to absorb friction, not to bet everything on one perfect run. Montgomery's approach remains decisive: concentrate, strike, and let decision do the work that months of grinding cannot. He wants priority in supplies and attention because priority, to him, is efficiency. His argument is framed in the language of ending the war sooner, saving lives by avoiding a prolonged winter campaign. But there is also narrative inside it. A single thrust produces a single story. A broad front produces shared credit, and shared credit is a quiet kind of defeat for a man who believes he has already proven his right to lead the decisive act. Between these theories, officers live like translators between two languages that are not only national but cultural. In British rooms, understatement is a form of discipline, and certainty is often expressed with calm restraint. In American rooms, bluntness is treated as honesty, and impatience is sometimes mistaken for energy. An officer might sit through one meeting where a British staffer says, "We have concerns," meaning the plan may fail catastrophically, then walk into another where an American says, "This is nonsense," meaning the speaker is simply tired. Trust must be translated, and translation always loses something. As weeks pass, resentments fossilize. They are no longer only about strategy. They become about status, about who is treated as the war's main character. The British fear being reduced to a supporting role in an American-led ending. Americans fear being lectured by a British icon whose demands seem to assume entitlement. Every operational dispute carries an emotional subtext, whose sacrifices are acknowledged, whose judgment is deferred to, whose mistakes are forgiven as boldness, and whose are condemned as incompetence. Eisenhower tries to keep the argument in the realm of systems, supply rates, port capacity, weather forecasts, German order of battle. But men do not bleed in systems. They bleed in divisions with histories and flags. Montgomery, meanwhile, continues to frame his proposals as clarity against American sprawl, as discipline against waste. Each time he speaks publicly or is perceived to speak publicly, he risks turning internal disagreements into national grievances. The coalition remains intact, but it begins to feel less like a single instrument and more like two instruments forced to play the same score. In the background, Germany watches. The German High Command does not need to defeat Allied industry to delay defeat. It needs only to exploit friction. The Western allies have momentum, but momentum is not armor. If the Germans can create confusion, cut communications, or force emergency decisions that inflame old resentments, they can buy time. Time for the Eastern Front to shape the post-war world, time for political pressure to grow, time for exhaustion to erode unity. And as autumn becomes winter, Germany prepares not merely a defensive line, but a surprise offensive designed to do exactly that. The foreshadowing is cruel because it is rational. A coalition arguing over strategy is a coalition vulnerable to shock. The Germans will aim not only at roads and rivers, but at the alliance's seams at the places where command relationships are already tense, where pride is already heavy. Soon, the front will be struck hard enough that theory will be replaced by survival, and command structures so often debated as matters of prestige will become tools to keep armies from collapsing. That is the turning point approaching in the dark of December, when the argument will no longer be about who should lead the final drive, but about who can restore order in a crisis. And in that crisis, pride will become dangerous weight, because the next decisions will be made under fog, under pressure, and under the ruthless clock of a German attack that chooses its moment well. In December 1944, Germany strikes through the weather itself. The attack comes under a ceiling of winter cloud and fog, so thick it feels like camouflage laid across the sky. Allied air power so dominant in clear conditions cannot see, cannot hunt, cannot punish movement on the roads. In that blindness, German columns roll forward, betting everything on surprise, on the forested ridges of the Ardennes, and on the human instinct to believe that a beaten enemy will not dare one last gamble. The first impact is not neat. It is confusion measured in cut phone lines and missing reports. The American line bends under brutal terrain and fractured communications, not from cowardice. Units are hit where the front is thin, where the ground is difficult, where green divisions and exhausted veterans share the same cold. Roads ice over, landmarks disappear under snow, orders take hours to travel. Men fight with imperfect knowledge, and in modern war, imperfect knowledge can feel like being attacked from behind. Yet the line does not break because the men are weak. It bends because the enemy has chosen a place designed to make coherence difficult. At Schaeff, Eisenhower reads the situation with the cold logic of a man who understands what panic can do to an alliance. He knows that the battlefield is only one part of the crisis. The other part is command, who speaks for whom when headquarters cannot communicate, and who can coordinate forces that are suddenly fighting in separate storms of information. Pride does not stop a breakthrough. Clarity sometimes can, and so Eisenhower makes a choice that would be politically painful even in calm conditions. He reorganizes command so the northern fight can function. In the north of the Bulge, key American forces, most notably the 1st Army and the 9th Army, are temporarily placed under Montgomery's direction. It is not a judgment of American competence. It is an act of survival. The battle has created a practical problem. The boundary between British and American command areas is now inside the crisis zone, and the normal channels are strained or broken. Montgomery's 21st Army Group headquarters is positioned to coordinate the northern shoulder, and coordination is what the moment demands. In a textbook, command is hierarchy. In a winter emergency, command is the shortest route to a working phone line. The order is typed in rooms where men have long memories. A staff officer watches the words appear on paper and swallows something bitter. He does not argue, because arguing does not stop German tanks. He does not protest, because protest is a luxury of stable fronts. He swallows rage as the order is signed and sent, because survival outranks sentiment. This is how discipline looks when it is real. Not prideful obedience, but obedience that costs something. Montgomery arrives to impose order, and for a moment, competence feels like redemption. He is methodical. He insists on clear lines, clear responsibilities, clear timetables for counteraction. In a crisis where uncertainty spreads like cold, clarity is warmth. He stabilizes the northern shoulder, helps coordinate defensive positions, and prepares counterstrokes with the careful pace that is his signature. Men who dislike him still admit, quietly, that order matters. A crisis does not care about personal feelings. A crisis rewards whatever works. And yet the narrator can already see the trap forming, because it is a trap laid by human nature as much as by enemy plan. When you are handed another man's crisis, it tempts you to claim another man's victory. If you arrive after the first shock and help restore structure, you can begin to speak as if structure was absent until you appeared. You can forget, or choose not to mention, the stubborn holding actions that kept the front from shattering, the small units that fought blind and cold in the first days, buying time with casualties no press conference can measure. The Ardennes becomes not only a battle of roads and ridges, but a battle of ownership. Americans will remember the surprise, the losses, the endurance in snow and fog. Montgomery will remember the moment he was given authority over American armies and what it implies about his indispensability. Eisenhower will remember something else, that he has just taken a step that keeps the coalition alive, and that the step will come with a political bill. Because when the fog lifts and the Germans begin to fall back, the question will not only be how the Allies recovered, the question will be who gets to tell the recovery as a story. And somewhere, waiting in January's cold light, a microphone will be placed in front of Montgomery, inviting him to turn another man's emergency into his own narrative. Montgomery's record in the northern Ardennes was not imaginary. He arrived into a fractured situation and did what he had always done best: impose a system. Headquarters functions were clarified, boundaries firmed, schedules tightened, and counterstrokes prepared with the careful tempo he trusted. In the cold weeks after December 16, order itself became a form of combat power. For soldiers staring into fog and forest, competence could feel like shelter, because when the front is uncertain, a reliable plan is the closest thing to warmth. And yet American frustration simmered beneath the surface, even while the crisis demanded cooperation. Being placed under a rival's command, however temporary, however practical, felt like a public bruise. Pride was not an abstract concept. It lived in the memory of units that had held roads, lost friends, and fought without clear information in the first days. They were not rescued from weakness, they believed. They had bought time with blood. The command arrangement made sense on paper, but war is not lived on paper. Early January brought a new danger, one no German artillery battery could deliver: the press. On the 7th of January 1945, Montgomery held a press conference at Zonhoven with the stated intent of explaining the battle and urging Allied solidarity. The setting was ordinary, the moment deceptively calm. Cameras and notebooks waited for a tidy narrative because the public always wants a battle to have a single spine, a single hand on the wheel. On paper, much of what he said could be defended. He praised American fighting spirit and emphasized teamwork under Eisenhower's overall command, even calling Ike the captain of the team. But tone is not only what is written, it is what is heard. His account lingered on his own management of the Northern battle, describing how power was brought into action and how the situation was handled, with a cadence that sounded at least to American ears like authorship. In a coalition, the difference between explaining and claiming can be only a few sentences long. The reaction was immediate, and it spread faster than any official clarification. Omar Bradley read reports of the briefing with a clenched jaw, hearing in them a quiet belittling of the American generals whose decisions had shaped the fight. Patton, never subtle, treated it as betrayal, another instance of a rival turning hard circumstances into personal proof. Their anger was not simply vanity. It came from arithmetic. Americans had carried the heaviest share of the battle, and they could not accept a narrative that implied they became effective only after Montgomery's arrival. Across the alliance, the emotional temperature spiked higher than enemy artillery. British officers, already sensitive to any suggestion that their contribution was secondary, bristled at the American fury and insisted that Montgomery had tried to defend Allied unity, not undermine it. Some journalists and observers even came away impressed by the clarity of his account, proof that a single event could split into multiple interpretations depending on where you stood. But in war, perception inside headquarters matters more than perception in headlines, because perception shapes whether commanders still trust the chain of command when the next crisis comes. This was the turning point, not because a speech changed the battlefield, but because it threatened to change the relationships that made the battlefield survivable. The bulge was still being reduced, the Germans still dangerous, and yet senior American commanders were now closer to open revolt than to quiet acceptance. Eisenhower could manage strategy. He could move armies. But now he faced a decision that belonged to the hidden war inside the war, whether to protect a British icon or protect the confidence of the Americans who believed they had just been written out of their own winter. And in the warm rooms of SHAEF, the next conversation was already forming. SHAEF, in those January days, felt less like a headquarters than a courtroom without witnesses. There were no juries, no transcripts read aloud, only consequences. The Battle of the Bulge was still being sealed shut at the edges, but the coalition's internal damage was spreading faster than any German withdrawal. Staff corridors carried rumors the way wind carries smoke, that American commanders were furious, that London was defensive, that Washington was watching. In coalition war, the loudest threats are rarely shouted. They arrive quietly, in the language of confidence withdrawn. Eisenhower understood what was truly at stake. He could not allow the alliance to be governed by wounded pride, because pride does not stop enemy offensives and does not deliver ammunition to the line. Yet he also could not pretend that pride was irrelevant. If the American senior leadership felt publicly diminished, if they believed their sacrifices were being claimed by another nation's hero, then obedience itself could begin to fray. It was not a question of courtesy. It was a question of whether the command structure would still hold when the next crisis demanded speed. What made the moment dangerous was not only Montgomery's speech, but the reaction to it. In private rooms, men spoke of resignation as a form of protest, an unthinkable gesture in the middle of a war, and therefore a powerful one. Whether the threat was fully formed or only half-spoken, it was enough. Eisenhower had spent years managing incompatible egos by balancing them. Now balancing would no longer work. A scale only functions until one side refuses the weight. So he confronted Montgomery without theatrics, because theatrics would feed the very problem he was trying to contain. He did not seek a duel of personalities. He delivered terms. The message was not complicated. Apologize, stop the damage, accept the boundary. In an alliance, discipline is often disguised as diplomacy, and diplomacy can still be a weapon when used with precision. Eisenhower's restraint did not soften the demand, it sharpened it. He was not asking Montgomery to clarify, he was requiring him to concede. This is where legend condenses history into a single remembered phrase, "You're done." People repeat it because it feels like the sentence that should have been spoken, the sentence that would have satisfied a room full of exhausted men who wanted the argument, ended with one clean blow. But Eisenhower's real action was more controlled and, in the long run, more absolute. He did not have to theatrically dismiss Montgomery to end Montgomery's leverage. He had to make it clear that the war's public narrative did not belong to any one commander, and that the Supreme Commander's authority extended to the story as well as the strategy. The apology that followed carried the taste of defeat precisely because it was necessary. In war, apologies are rarely about feelings. They are about hierarchy. Montgomery could defend his intentions. He could argue that he meant to praise teamwork. None of that mattered now as much as the impression he had created, and impressions, once embedded, become operational hazards. So he issued words that attempted to repair what words had damaged, and the very act of doing so signaled that the boundary had been enforced. A famous man had been required to step back, publicly, for the sake of the machine. Around the same time, the temporary command arrangement began to unwind as the front stabilized and communications normalized. American control returned to American armies not as an insult to British competence, but as a restoration of the proper structure. The crisis necessity ended, and with it ended the unusual leverage that necessity had granted. In a coalition, emergencies can rearrange authority. Normalcy puts it back. And as the northern shoulder hardened and the Germans were pushed back toward their starting lines, Eisenhower quietly reassembled the hierarchy that the bulge had temporarily distorted. The climax, like many decisive moments in coalition warfare, landed without spectacle. There was no dramatic dismissal, no public humiliation staged for history's cameras. There was simply authority restoring the shape of command, like a hand straightening a bent frame before it cracks. Eisenhower had not defeated Montgomery in a battle. He had defeated the idea that any one man could speak as if the alliance needed his ego to function. Yet the cost remained. Trust does not return instantly because a boundary is drawn. It returns slowly, through controlled messages, careful meetings, and the discipline of leaders choosing not to inflame what they could inflame. The coalition survived because it had to survive, because Germany was still capable of killing thousands, and because the war did not pause for personal reconciliation. And as the armies prepared to resume the final drive into the Reich, one reality became quietly unavoidable. The war would continue, but the signature on its story who got to speak for victory had just been taken out of Montgomery's hands. The fighting did not pause for wounded pride. Winter still hung over the front, and Germany still resisted with the stubbornness of a cornered state. But after Eisenhower drew his line, something intangible changed inside the coalition. Montgomery's political room narrowed. He remained a field commander with an army group, a staff, and a nation behind him. Yet his voice no longer set the coalition's tone. The center of gravity shifted back toward Schaeff's deliberate balance toward the principle that no single man would be allowed to speak as if he owned the war. That shift could be felt in what was not said. Briefings became cleaner, less ornamental. Statements were drafted with the awareness that every adjective might be interpreted as a claim. The microphones still existed, but they were treated like weapons that required safeties. The alliance had learned the hard way that public language could fracture private cooperation, and in a campaign still measured in casualties and kilometers, cooperation remained the one advantage Germany could not manufacture. As the front stabilized and then pushed forward again, the final drive became less about one commander's grand personal stroke and more about mass and coordination. The war was beginning to end the way industrial wars tend to end, by weight. Armies advanced as systems supported by fuel calculations, bridging schedules, air superiority, and the methodical reduction of German capacity. Success depended not on the elegance of a single idea, but on the alignment of many moving parts. Timing mattered. Supply mattered. Weather mattered. Air power mattered. And above all, the ability to keep pressure across multiple fronts mattered because Germany could no longer be allowed the mercy of focusing on one threat at a time. From the macro lens, it looked almost impersonal. Operations were planned as interlocking pressures, one push-drawing reserves, another breaking a line, another exploiting a gap. Staff officers spoke in tonnage and road nets, in sortie rates and river crossings. It was the kind of warfare that does not create one dramatic moment to be framed as a lone commander's triumph. It creates a slow inevitability terrible in its scale, and effective precisely because it cannot be claimed by any single personality. In British headquarters, the chill could be felt without any official announcement. Staff officers, who had once assumed Montgomery's status, made him untouchable, now read rooms differently. The field marshal was still treated with deference. He still issued orders, still commanded, still carried the aura of El Alamein. But the insulation had thinned. A remark that might once have been indulged now met polite silence. A suggestion that might once have been amplified now passed through filters. The man remained powerful, yet he was no longer immune to consequence, because immunity, in a coalition, is a privilege granted only as long as it does not endanger the whole. This was the hidden cost that seldom appears on maps. Reputations do not bleed, but they can still cripple trust. When senior leaders begin to suspect each other's motives, every delay becomes suspicious. Every casualty becomes political. Every decision becomes a referendum on respect. The front line may hold, but the alliance behind it begins to move stiffly, as if joints have swollen. Eisenhower's boundary was meant to prevent that stiffness from becoming paralysis. It was a corrective not to Montgomery's competence, but to the damage that competence could not offset when paired with public self-importance. So Schaeff tightened message discipline. Public fractures became rarer. Narratives were controlled, phrased to emphasize collective effort rather than individual salvation. It was not censorship in the melodramatic sense. It was maintenance. A coalition is a machine, and machines require constant tightening of bolts, constant inspection of stress points. The press could not be eliminated, but it could be managed, guided, prevented from becoming an open seam. The enemy could pry apart with nothing more than time. And that leaves the final question hanging over the month that followed, as the Allies resumed the slow work of closing on Germany. If Montgomery was not dismissed, if his army group still advanced and his rank still stood, then what exactly was ended? The answer is not found in an order of battle. It is found in something quieter. The moment the coalition decided that the war's story would move forward without his signature, and the man who enforced that decision was already preparing to explain it without making the alliance break. What ended was not Montgomery's commission, not his rank, not even his relevance on the battlefield. What ended was a more delicate possession, the claim that one man's theory could own the coalition's future and therefore own the meaning of victory. In an alliance, destiny cannot belong to a single personality without becoming a hostage. Eisenhower did not have to defeat Montgomery's competence. He had to defeat the idea that competence grants the right to narrate everyone else. Seen in that light, the boundary drawn in January 1945 was not sudden. It was the latest point on a line that had been visible for months. The earlier confrontation in September, steady, "I'm your boss," was proof that limits already existed. They had simply been softened by necessity, delayed by the constant fear of fracture, and disguised by the polite language that coalitions use to survive. Eisenhower had been warning, in the most restrained way possible, that no reputation would be allowed to outrank the structure. That September moment matters because it reveals the central tension of the whole story. Montgomery pressed for strategic monopoly because he believed concentration and certainty were virtues that could be willed into reality. Eisenhower resisted because he understood that monopoly in a coalition is rarely just about operational efficiency. It becomes political gravity. The more one man receives priority, the more the war begins to look as though it must pass through him to end. That is not merely a plan, it is a throne, built out of fuel allocations and public perception. The Ardennes speech, then, was not simply a public relations mistake. It was proof that political instinct can fail even when military competence holds. Montgomery could impose order in the north, coordinate under pressure, and help stabilize a crisis. A man can be right in his methods and wrong in his meaning. The problem was not that he did nothing. The problem was that his tone invited a conclusion, subtle, deniable, but unmistakable to those already bruised, that Americans fought better under him, that American sacrifice required British direction to become effective. In war, intent is personal, effect is strategic. Inside Schaeff, Eisenhower's staff learned, in real time, where the Supreme Commander's true battlefield lay. It was not only the line on the map, it was the morale between allies, the invisible bond that allows soldiers of different flags to accept one another's authority without feeling diminished. An artillery plan can be rewritten, a supply schedule can be adjusted. But once senior leaders begin to believe the alliance itself is unjust, every operational choice becomes infected with suspicion. The war then becomes two wars, one against Germany and one against resentment. This is the larger lesson modern war keeps teaching, over and over. It rewards systems that can absorb great men without being ruled by them. Great commanders matter, but industrial war, coalition war, cannot be allowed to depend on a single temperament. If victory requires one personality's continual approval, then victory is always one disagreement away from delay. Eisenhower's achievement was not brilliance in a single battle. It was the maintenance of a structure strong enough to carry many egos without collapsing under their weight. The moral irony sharpens when we look at what Montgomery risked by needing to be seen as savior. His competence did help at critical moments. His insistence on method saved lives in some contexts. Yet his need for authorship threatened to damage the very victory he helped secure, because coalitions do not survive on tactical skill alone. They survive on mutual respect, on the willingness to let credit be shared, and to let necessity, not vanity, decide who speaks for the whole. When a commander cannot tolerate being one part of a machine, he begins to endanger the machine. Eisenhower's boundary, therefore, was not humiliation for its own sake. It was containment. It was the quiet choice to protect the alliance's function from the distortions of celebrity. In another kind of war, such a moment might have been settled by firing a man, or by tolerating him and hoping time would dull the edges. But Eisenhower did something more difficult. He enforced humility without spectacle, because spectacle is what ego feeds on. And here is the sober truth the story leaves us with. A coalition is a weapon, but only if it is kept intact. It can crush an enemy that no single nation could crush alone, but it can also turn on itself if pride is allowed to become policy. By January 1945, Eisenhower understood that the final drive into Germany would demand not only tanks and fuel, but disciplined silence and agreement, spoken and unspoken, about what would not be said again. Because back at that desk, in that warm room behind the winter front, another decision waited, one final act of restraint that would outlast any speech, and teach the alliance how to finish the war without letting vanity write the ending. We return to the desk where the story began. A warm room behind the winter front, paper on wood, the war reduced for a moment to sentences. Eisenhower sits with the same calm posture that fooled so many men into thinking he felt nothing. Yet the calm is not emptiness. It is control. He chooses containment over spectacle, because spectacle is what ego feeds on. And he has learned painfully that in a coalition, feeding ego is another way of starving the front. The decision he makes is not dramatic. It will not produce a photograph that history textbooks can caption with certainty. It will not satisfy the human desire for a clean ending, a hero punished or redeemed. Instead, he tightens the bolts on the alliance. He makes sure the apology stands, that the message discipline holds, that the hierarchy is understood without being announced like a triumph. In a different kind of war, this might look like weakness. In this war, it is a weapon, the ability to deny vanity the oxygen of attention. From the macro lens, the Western Allies finished the war not through a single decisive gesture, but through coordination. Logistics becomes the bloodstream again, ports opened, roads repaired, rail lines restored, fuel pushed forward in quantities that make speed possible. Combined arms, doctrine, infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, air power, operates less as theory than as routine. Priorities are negotiated, then enforced. Pressure is applied across fronts until Germany is forced to respond everywhere at once. The war ends the way it is truly won, by systems that do not require one voice to be louder than the rest. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over headquarters after a public fracture has been sealed. It is not peace, it is caution. A veteran, years later, might remember not the speech, not even the outrage, but the silence afterward, the way rooms learned to speak carefully again, the way sentences became shorter, the way praise became collective, the way officers stopped testing how much private resentment could be carried into public language. The silence is not emptiness, it is discipline returning, the alliance teaching itself how to breathe without coughing. That is the final lesson the war leaves behind. Coalitions win by limiting vanity, even when vanity wears medals. They win not only by adding tanks and men, but by subtracting the impulses that make partners compete when they should combine. A coalition is always more fragile than it appears, because it is built from national memory and personal pride as much as from steel. It can be destroyed without losing a battle by words, by tone, by the slow accumulation of perceived insult. Montgomery remains a great commander in this story, and history should not be flattened into caricature. He brought method to chaos, confidence to weary armies, and competence to moments that demanded it. But greatness is not immunity, and reputation is not entitlement. A commander can be brilliant and still be dangerous to an alliance if he cannot accept being one part of a larger machine. The war does not require saints. It requires men who can be contained when their strengths begin to threaten the whole. Eisenhower's authority, in the end, is shown as moral as well as structural. He does not protect the alliance by humiliating its icons. He protects it by enforcing humility. He understands that command is not only the movement of armies, but the management of meaning who feels respected, who feels slighted, who believes the burden is shared. In that sense, his battlefield is invisible, and his victory is measured not in captured ground but in preserved cohesion. He prevents a fracture that Germany could never have created alone. The irony of the title lands softly, because it is not the kind of ending that invites celebration. The sentence people remember, whether spoken exactly that way or not, endures because it expresses something rare. A boundary drawn without rage, an ego halted without spectacle, a coalition saved by the refusal to indulge personal myth. In the winter of 1945, the most effective weapon Eisenhower used was not a tank, not a bomber, not even an order. It was restraint. He didn't defeat Montgomery with a battle, he defeated him with a boundary.